Imagine a world at war, where hatred runs so deep that nations are tearing each other apart. Now picture this: German soldiers, captured and shipped thousands of miles away to the United States, expecting punishment, humiliation, maybe even cruelty. Yet instead of facing bitterness, they found themselves invited to community dances, church picnics, and even family dinners. It sounds impossible, almost like fiction. But during World War II, this actually happened. And the contrast was so shocking that many of those German prisoners of war couldn't believe their eyes, or their hearts. The story begins in 1942, when America entered the war with full force. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, Nazi divisions tore across Europe, and Allied soldiers were being captured on both sides. America faced a strange challenge: what to do with tens of thousands of German POWs who were surrendering in North Africa, Italy, and later France. The Geneva Convention demanded humane treatment, but the sheer scale was overwhelming. By the end of the war, nearly 400,000 German prisoners would be shipped across the ocean to the United States itself, scattered in camps across the Midwest, the South, and rural towns that had never even seen a German before. For many Americans, the thought of having enemy soldiers living just down the road sounded terrifying. These were the men fighting for Hitler, the very people killing American boys overseas. Fear, suspicion, and anger were natural. Yet something remarkable happened. Instead of building walls of hostility, many communities, ordinary farmers, housewives, teenagers, chose a different path. They extended unexpected kindness. The prisoners were put to work, often in agriculture, because America desperately needed labor with so many young men away at war. German POWs picked cotton in Texas, harvested wheat in Kansas, cut timber in Wisconsin, and even worked in canneries and factories. They were paid modest wages, as required by international law, but what really shocked them wasn't the work, it was how civilians treated them. Here were enemy soldiers, yet local Americans often greeted them with a nod, a smile, sometimes even a meal. Farmers brought them water on hot days. Town kids would sneak close to the camps to talk to them. Some women, at great risk of gossip, found themselves curious about these young men who were supposed to be the enemy, but who looked and acted like boys not much older than their own brothers. And then came the dances. Yes, actual dances, small-town gatherings with music, food, and laughter. German POWs couldn't believe it when American civilians invited them to participate. Imagine their shock. One week they had been fighting in North Africa under Rommel, and the next they were swaying awkwardly to swing music in a Texas barn, partnered with smiling local girls in floral dresses. For these men, who expected hatred, the warmth was almost unbearable. Some wrote in their diaries that it was more disorienting than battle itself. But why did this happen? Why did Americans show such humanity to men who were technically their sworn enemies? Part of the answer lies in culture. Many of the towns hosting POW camps were made up of families with German ancestry themselves. Their grandparents had come from Bavaria, Prussia, or Saxony, and even if they now proudly called themselves American, there was still a shared language, food, and heritage. Hearing the German tongue didn't feel entirely foreign. To some, it was almost like hosting distant cousins who had been misled by terrible leaders. Another reason was simple humanity. These prisoners were far from home, cut off from families, uncertain if they'd ever return. When civilians looked at them, they didn't just see Nazis. They saw scared young men, some barely 18, who had been swept up by war. It was hard to maintain hatred when face to face with individuals who laughed, blushed, and cried just like everyone else. Of course, not everyone was comfortable. Some Americans despised the POWs and felt furious that they were treated with kindness while American soldiers were suffering in brutal camps overseas. Reports of the Bataan Death March and Japanese atrocities in Asia fueled anger. Why should we treat them so well, some demanded, when our boys are starving as prisoners? This anger simmered in many communities, and at times, it boiled over. Yet in countless towns, the opposite spirit prevailed. The contrast between expectation and reality became one of the strangest social experiments of World War II. POWs who thought they would be beaten discovered generosity. And for Americans who thought they could never forgive, some discovered compassion. Letters home from German prisoners reveal just how surreal the experience felt. One wrote, "We are treated like humans here. The Americans give us good food, good clothes, even the chance to learn English. It is more than we ever imagined." Another confided, "At the dances, I forgot I was a prisoner. For a few hours, I felt like a normal young man again." These testimonies capture the heart of the story. The sheer impossibility of enemy soldiers and civilians sharing moments of joy during the bloodiest war in history. But this unexpected kindness wasn't just about generosity. It was also about strategy. The U.S. government believed that humane treatment would not only comply with the Geneva Convention but also influence the larger war effort. If German soldiers heard from returning POWs that Americans treated them decently, perhaps more would surrender instead of fighting to the death. And in fact, many historians believe this strategy worked. Word spread among German units that captivity under the Americans was far better than under the Soviets, where brutal treatment was common. Surrendering to the Americans became a lifeline. Still, nothing captures the emotional intensity like those dances. Picture it, a rural town hall lit with lanterns, a local band playing jazz standards, the air buzzing with laughter and the sound of shoes tapping against wooden floors. On one side, American girls nervously whispering to each other. On the other side, German POWs, uncertain, awkward, stunned that they were even allowed here. Then someone pushes them together, and suddenly enemies are partners, moving in rhythm, their laughter breaking through barriers that seemed unbreakable just days earlier. For the POWs, this wasn't just a night of music. It was a crack in the wall of propaganda. Back home, they had been told Americans were monsters, decadent, cruel, heartless. Yet here they were, face to face with kindness that shook them to their core. Some later admitted that those dances planted seeds of doubt about everything they had been taught under Nazi rule. If the enemy could treat them this well, maybe the world wasn't as simple as they had been told. The irony is haunting. While battle raged across Europe, while bombs fell on cities, while millions suffered, here in America's heartland, German POWs were laughing, dancing, and momentarily forgetting the war. For the locals, too, it was surreal. How could they laugh with the enemy while their own brothers, husbands, and sons fought overseas? The answer lay in the strange human truth that face-to-face encounters often dissolve the hatred that distance creates. This paradox is what makes the story unforgettable. It wasn't about forgiveness or forgetting. It was about something deeper, the recognition of shared humanity in the unlikeliest of places. And yet, this was only the beginning. Because as the war dragged on, relationships between German POWs and American civilians grew even more complex, sometimes even dangerous. Some POWs fell in love with local women. Others developed bonds with the very communities they were supposed to despise. Letters, gifts, and secret meetings followed, leaving behind stories that would echo for decades. In next few minutes, we'll dive even deeper into these extraordinary connections, the forbidden romances, the friendships that endured after the war, and the moments when kindness became a weapon stronger than bullets. Because what happened when German POWs were invited to dances wasn't just a curiosity, it was a window into the strange, unpredictable ways war reshapes humanity. When German POWs first stepped into those American barns for the community dances, they were stunned. But as weeks turned into months, what started as curiosity began to grow into something far more complicated. These were not just evenings of music and laughter anymore. They became emotional crossroads, where lives intertwined in ways no one could have predicted. For the local girls, many of whom had brothers fighting overseas, the dances were bittersweet. On the one hand, they longed for companionship, music, and the joy of youth. On the other, they knew they were smiling at men wearing the uniforms of the enemy. The contradiction was overwhelming, and yet, once the music started, it was impossible to deny the pull of human connection. Some of the German prisoners were tall, polite, well-mannered, traits that stood out in towns where young men were away at war. These girls found themselves drawn in despite themselves. What began as harmless conversation after a dance sometimes turned into letters slipped secretly through fences, or small meetings arranged away from watchful eyes. For the prisoners, starved of affection and family warmth, these connections became lifelines. But they were also dangerous. Camp rules strictly forbade fraternization. American authorities worried that romances between POWs and local women would create scandals, weaken discipline, or even stir resentment among families whose sons were still in harm's way. Yet no matter how many rules existed, human hearts ignored them. In diaries and letters smuggled home, German prisoners confessed to feelings they never expected to have on enemy soil. One former POW later recalled, "There was a girl who looked at me not as a prisoner, not as an enemy, but simply as a man. That look broke me more than any battlefield ever did." Such moments revealed the fragile, haunting truth. Behind the politics and uniforms, individuals longed for the same thing: connection, recognition, love. Meanwhile, many American communities began to see the POWs not just as outsiders, but as part of daily life. They worked on farms, attended church services under guard, and even helped rebuild barns destroyed by storms. In some towns, children would run up to them, practicing broken German phrases with giggles, while prisoners replied in halting English. The sight of the enemy, fixing fences alongside farmers, created an image that blurred the line between captor and captive. But the paradox grew sharper as war news trickled back. Letters arrived from the front describing American boys held in brutal camps in Europe and Asia, starved, beaten, sometimes never returning. Families who read these letters often asked, "Why do we let them dance while our sons suffer?" The anger was real. And yet, the daily kindness in many towns continued. It was as if two realities coexisted: rage at the enemy's cruelty abroad, and compassion for the enemy's humanity at home. For the POWs, these contrasts were soul-shaking. In Germany, propaganda painted Americans as greedy, violent, and soulless. Yet here, they were handed bread, invited to meals, and treated with dignity. One German soldier wrote home in disbelief, "They do not hate us here. I cannot understand it. They should hate us. Instead, they smile." The psychological impact of this treatment was profound. For many prisoners, it broke apart the ideology they had been raised on. Nazi propaganda crumbled when confronted with the warmth of a farmer's wife who offered them pie, or the laughter of a child who saw no enemy in their face. Some POWs admitted that their loyalty to Hitler's regime weakened the longer they stayed in America. The kindness they experienced did what bombs could not: it reshaped minds. And yet, the bonds went even deeper. Some German prisoners formed friendships with American guards who watched over them. Guards and prisoners swapped cigarettes, told jokes, and even shared photographs of families back home. These small acts blurred the line between duty and friendship. Imagine a guard watching a prisoner carefully, gun at his side, while also laughing with him about the same kind of music or food they both missed. It was an impossible contradiction, and yet it happened again and again. Romances were the most haunting of all. In rare but unforgettable cases, POWs and American women fell deeply in love. Letters were exchanged secretly, promises whispered under the cover of darkness. Some of these romances endured even after the war. When the conflict ended and the prisoners were sent back to Germany, a few women followed their hearts, marrying the very men who had once been enemies. For communities, these love stories were shocking, even scandalous. But for the people living them, they were undeniable. Love had triumphed where war had failed. Of course, not every story ended so tenderly. Some bonds were shattered by the cruel reality of war. Prisoners who promised to return never made it back, swallowed by the chaos of post-war Germany. Others were separated forever by oceans, politics, and the disapproval of families who could never accept such unions. The heartbreak of these partings was sharp, reminding everyone that while compassion could bloom, the world was still ruled by the scars of conflict. As the war neared its end, these relationships and experiences left deep marks on both sides. German POWs carried home stories of unexpected kindness that contrasted sharply with the destruction in Europe. Many told their families, "The Americans treated us like people, not animals." Some even returned to the United States years later, seeking out the towns where they had once been held, hoping to thank the families who had shown them compassion. For Americans, the memories lingered too. Townspeople who once feared the arrival of enemy soldiers remembered the friendships, the shared meals, the strange nights of music where enemies danced together. These stories became part of local folklore, passed down as proof that even in the darkest times, humanity could shine through. Looking back, historians have pointed out how strategic and symbolic this treatment was. America's decision to treat prisoners with decency was not only about morality, it was about shaping the future. By showing mercy, the U.S. planted seeds of democracy, friendship, and reconciliation. For many German prisoners, their time in American camps became the first glimpse of a world beyond dictatorship, a world where dignity and respect were possible even in defeat. And that is why this story remains so haunting today. Because in a war defined by cruelty, genocide, and unthinkable suffering, there were also moments of warmth that defied logic. Enemy soldiers dancing with civilians. Prisoners writing home about kindness. Local girls falling in love with men in enemy uniforms. These were contradictions that no general could plan, no government could fully control. They were raw, human moments, born from the strange chemistry of war. In the end, the story of German POWs dancing with American civilians is not just about the past. It's a reminder about the power of empathy, even in times of unimaginable conflict. It shows how kindness can disarm ideology, how laughter can cut deeper than propaganda, and how human connection can survive even in the shadow of hate. For the POWs, those dances were unforgettable. For the Americans, they were confusing but strangely beautiful. And for history, they stand as proof that humanity can sometimes rise higher than war itself. Because in the end, when the music started and the soldiers and civilians stepped onto the dance floor, they were no longer enemies. They were simply human. And if stories like this make you stop and think, if they remind you that even in the darkest chapters of history, human connection still found a way, then don't just scroll past. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the hidden stories the textbooks leave out. Drop a comment below. What do you think? Should enemy soldiers and civilians ever have been allowed to dance together during war? Your thoughts might just spark the next big discussion here. Because this channel isn't just about history. It's about uncovering the side of history that still makes us question, still makes us feel, and still makes us wonder, what would we have done if we were there? So stay curious, stay human, and I'll see you in the next story.